Many of the words that come to mind as one remembers, and I think as always happens with the death of a great woman or a great man, uses to evaluate what remains, what survives of the life. Words belong to other people. Man for all seasons, gentleman and scholar, a man wise and seasoned enough to see present time and yet live for futures. His own, always his family's, his many and vast communities. Really challenges the language we use to describe a great man. There's a life story, perhaps two life stories, his and Nesta's, melded. And these narratives, embracing their uncommon and distinctive children and grandchildren, their stories always including origins, always describing where they and we in some sense come from, and always including family and current life and futures, and above all, their hopes and aspirations for other people. I think each of us has known Rui in some distinctive way. My own small part of him has to do with a role he played almost silently, beginning at the time when I became president and continuing through to the end of the presidency and long after. I came here in August of 1990. Rui had advised our board during the search. He was one of the voices of the faculty in describing what the university was to do in the years after I came. He wrote to me before I moved back to Virginia, and he offered help, but he also remained in remarkably close touch for as long as he lived. In these years, and I suspect after I went on to other duties in 2010, some parts of this relationship seemed to transfer naturally to President Sullivan. And the reason, I think, is that Rui has been, in every good sense, our university's curator, one who has cared for it, who has defined what it is, who has been able to interpret it to others who came to need his services. He observed and spoke not for himself, but instead for the university itself. First and foremost for its faculty, for the life of the mind as it's pursued within the university, and then in a kind of natural sequence for its students and for work. He admired the common work done in this place, and he interpreted it as he talked about what actions, what attitudes, what philosophies are most appropriate to the university at any given time. Sitting sometimes in my office and sometimes beside telephones when times were urgent, and most often and most pleasantly at leisure in the singular house and gardens that Rui and Nesta built and shared, in the living room with its rugs and the books and the genteel treasures that they shared between them, often Persian treasures. Rui talked sometimes about the objects of his affection. Always he spoke of Nesta. He was proud of her accomplishments, of her writings, of her creations, and not least of her cuisine, an art form singularly her own, and yet an element of a great tradition. But he talked also about colleagues, about former students, about officials of governments, sometimes governments long gone, at other times governments alive, and in one sense or another, depending on Rui's wisdom. He could describe, always respectfully, always modestly, his children's triumphs and their continuing efforts. He talked about his own writings. He talked, perhaps most importantly in recent years, about his sense of urgency with regard to speaking to a local public, to the public addressed in his articles in the Daily Progress. He tried to pursue large issues and to make them accessible. Arguments that were, by the way, not vastly different from those he made in other times and other contexts to the heads of state, to the great scholars. He was remarkably consistent in the intellectual assessment of what is the appropriate action to take with regard to the areas on which he was an expert. He described hopes successful and sometimes not, including his own hopes for peace in and around Iran. He spoke with the wisdom of a man of age as he became older, and yet always with the optimism of a young person, still defining his own perceptions, always hoping that humankind would find resolutions to antipathies that make no sense except that they exist, and that created remarkable kinds of suffering in the parts of the world that Rui cared most about. Above all, he always spoke for others, for their work. He spoke for the university, and he brought to all of these topics his special gravitas, his dignity, his modesty, and his restless aspirations, especially aspirations for others. He may have left us in his dying with the gift of a context for a life lived well and always directed outward. This context, always a context including Nesta in the definition, always referential to family, and yet defined by the elegance of the place where he most often wanted to visit, defined among the treasures in the context of the two worlds, one Persian and full of traditions and grand, and the other sometimes conceived on the smaller scale of our American Republic, something quite different and yet somehow consistent in Rui's understanding of what humankind ought to accomplish. I've thought of Rui in these last several days in the terms of two lives blended, in the terms of the elegance that lives on, Nesta, in you, and have realized that that dignity, that gravitas, is a gift that he was able to extend to his family, perhaps to all around him. Rui leaves reminders of himself. They're all around us. They're in our minds and our memories. What a splendid man. What a splendid friend. How fortunate we've all been.
Has there ever been anybody like Rui Ramazani? Not that I've ever met. He was a born diplomat, a superb judge of character, and a man who used his prominent positions to accomplish good things. Rui was a public intellectual who worked hard to reach broader audiences and inform them, and thus fulfill Jefferson's wish that his university be a beacon of enlightenment to the nation and the world. Because he understood human nature so well, Rui always chose just the right words to convince. And if you wanted to achieve something difficult, and you had the sense to ask Rui's advice, and then you followed that advice, which was often quite detailed, step by step, leaving little to chance, you had excellent odds to succeed. I wish I'd listened to him more about this election. More about that some other time. All of our modern university presidents, as John has just suggested, sought Rui's counsel. He played a vital behind-the-scenes role in resolving several crises here, always quietly, using gentle persuasion and hospitality. It was amazing how cooperative people could become after lunch or drinks at his and Nesta's beautiful home with that glorious view of rolling hills. Rui usually got his way without the use of home and hospitality. I learned this long ago. I think you know about this, John. I was doing a graduate degree in another country before the age of the internet or even good telephone service. One day I received both a telegram and a letter from Rui saying, in essence, why don't you come back to your alma mater and teach for a year or two before going on to what we all know you're going to do, law school and politics. I said no, because I'd already committed to a law school elsewhere. I had sent in my deposit, not returnable, and signed a housing lease. Within 2 weeks of back and forth communications, Rui had rewritten my entire future. As so many of you know, he would never take no for an answer. He was relentless. It was easier just to give in. I'm I'm very glad he was so convincing, but I did never introduce Rui, I don't believe, to my parents. They were furious that their early retirement plans based on projected legal earnings had been dashed. In the weeks since Rui left us, I've thought a lot about him, as I know all of you have. I truly cannot imagine the University of Virginia without Rui Ramazani. We will never forget him, and his many stellar contributions will serve as his impressive monument. Hail and farewell, dear friend.
Larry and I obviously knew the same man because his stories and my stories will bear a certain resemblance. I owe a huge debt to Rui Ramazani. It's not too much to say that he changed my life, and in a good way. Sometime in the early 1990s, Rui, whom I had known through professional contacts, but not yet on a personal basis, reached out to me with a question. Would I be interested in joining the Department of Government and Foreign Affairs, as it was then known, at the University of Virginia? At the time, my family and I were comfortably settled in Washington, D.C., and I did not know much about UVA or Charlottesville. But Rui eventually persuaded me to come down for a visit, and another, and another. And during this courtship, or so it seemed to me, I came to appreciate Rui's charm, his gentlemanly manners, his genuine love for UVA and Charlottesville, and I was fortunate to meet his secret weapon, Nesta, who added her charm and vivacity, as well as her superb Persian cuisine, we all seem to mention that, to the list of attractions that would await us if we did decide to come to UVA. In 1994, I joined the department, and I've never had a moment's regret. From this first sustained encounter with Rui, I learned to appreciate his many virtues. But here I want to stress something other than the kind and gentle side of the man. Rui also liked to get his way, as Larry also noted. He did not easily take no or even maybe for an answer. He knew what he wanted, and he was determined and persistent in trying to get it. And I think those were qualities that also served him well in his great project of trying to build bridges between his country of birth, Iran, and his country of choice, the United States. Especially after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, it was not easy to promote good relations between the two countries. But on a very deep level, Rui knew that there would be a time when the two peoples, the two countries, would need to overcome their differences. I recall quite vividly a moment when Rui's determination to push the U.S.-Iran relationship a notch forward was on display. In 2006, he had managed to arrange for the former Iranian president, Mohammad Khatami, to come to UVA to give a talk in the Rotunda. It was a big event. There was lots of interest, and Khatami spoke optimistically about a dialogue among civilizations, not the clash of civilizations that was then a fashionable theme. When the talk was over, I saw Rui earnestly engaged in an intense discussion with Khatami, in Persian, so I couldn't understand it. But he later told me that he was trying to persuade Khatami to come back to Charlottesville and to visit Monticello. It was not enough for him to just speak at UVA. He had to pay homage to Jefferson as well. Khatami clearly did not want to make the trip. He complained that he did not have time in his schedule, he did not like the long car ride, and so forth. 2 days later, however, he was back in Charlottesville, a quick visit to Monticello, and lunch with a group that Rui had hastily convened. Rui sat through the lunch, saying little, but looking very pleased. His determination and persistence had paid off. The last time I had a serious conversation with Rui was just after the successful negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program. Rui had long argued that negotiations could succeed if they were conducted on a basis of mutual interest and mutual respect. And finally, that had happened. We were both hopeful that the agreement would eventually lead to further positive steps toward normalizing relations between the United States and Iran. Unfortunately, he did not live to see that hope fully realized, but I'm sure that he never gave up his belief that the two countries would eventually come closer together. Today, when there is so much uncertainty about the future and so much at stake, we should all remember Ruhi's ability to keep his eye on the goal, to pursue it with his qualities of decency and thoughtfulness, as well as his determination and persistence. By combining those qualities, he was able to make a real difference. He will be greatly missed by all who knew him.
When I first heard that Ruhi had passed, I couldn't believe my ears. Over the years, seeing him defeat illness after illness, ailment after ailment, and writing op-eds and editing books at the same time, mind you, Amina and I had been completely convinced that his immense intellect and compassion were not his only divine qualities, but that he truly was immortal. After all, how could someone who wrote a study on the foreign policy of Iran from 1500 to 1973 be immortal? I first got to know Ruhi as I was a student of international relations. I read everything he wrote, every book, every article, every op-ed, and it took me all the way till 2003 to amass the courage to send him an email to see if he would be willing to serve on my PhD committee. I absolutely did not expect him to say yes, and I was beyond thrilled when I got that email from him saying that he would be happy to do so. And ever since, I've benefited so greatly from his wisdom, from his warmth, from his guidance. But it wasn't just wisdom that he offered, it was also friendship. Whenever his health permitted, Amina and I and the kids loved to come and visit his beautiful house in the mountains of Charlottesville and just be with him and Nesta. And I know I'm the 10th person here saying it today, but we also came for Nesta's amazing cooking. My kids loved going there, loved being there with him and with Nesta. And when Darish and Jamil were only 3 and 4 years old, he always took them out to the garden in the back to pick out the ripe tomatoes and then feed the fish. And every year, they still insisted, when are we going to go back to Ruhi's house to feed the fish and to pick the tomatoes? There was a unique serenity whenever we were in Ruhi's presence. I told him that his home up in the mountains, surrounded by those mountains, was a small slice of paradise. But it was Ruhi and Nesta that completed that paradise, not the majesty of the mountains encircling him. I'm so glad that he was with us when the United States and Iran finally moved beyond enmity to strike that nuclear deal. For more than 60 years, he had worked so hard and played a pivotal role in increasing understanding of Iran in the United States. And for more than 30 years, he had relentlessly worked to help resolve their tensions. The nuclear deal was in no small part a triumph for Ruhi in more ways than one. This paradigm shift in America's thinking on Iran was very much the result of scholars inspired by Ruhi, slowly but surely chipping away and changing our perception and understanding of the complexities of Iran. Indeed, had Ruhi not paved the way for this path towards peace, I have great doubts that diplomacy ever could have been successful between the United States and Iran. Now, only weeks after Ruhi left us, we realized that that path to peace remains filled with peril. The knowledge that we have learned, that so much we owe to him, now risks being unlearned. But whatever the future holds, it is incomparable to the challenges and obstacles Ruhi overcame and the false images that he dispelled. As we now face these perils on the path that Ruhi charted for us, we owe it to him to follow his example and exhibit the same patience, the dignity, and persistence he did. Amin and I and the kids will miss Ruhi immensely. But some way, somehow, I am now more convinced than ever before that if we follow his example, the mark he has made on this earth has made him truly immortal. We love you, Ruhi, dearly, and we will miss you with all of our heart. Thank you.
It's a magnificent honor, privilege to be able to share with you a few thoughts. I know there's so many other former students of Professor Ramazani here with us, colleagues, so many who benefited from Ruhi's life of service over the years, and it's a privilege for me to share with you a few thoughts of my own. Ruhi Ramazani, the professor, as we used to call him, the professor at the university, the Dean of Iran, the widely reputed Dean of Iranian Foreign Policy Studies, the spiritual father, as he was called, of the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, the recipient of this university's highest awards in its esteem, including the University of Virginia's Jefferson Award, and yes, the man who changed my life and countless other students, Ruhi Ramazani, has departed from us. As Michael Collins Dunn, the editor of the Venerable Middle East Journal, put it, we have lost one of the giants in our field. Our esteemed colleagues and friends here today have, and they've already reminded us of Ruhi Ramazani's great thoughts, his words, his deeds of the past. I would like to shift our focus just a little bit to contemplate the enduring Ruhi Ramazani legacies for the future. Just as Jefferson would want to be remembered for three things: authoring the Declaration of Independence and the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, plus founding this great university, so too I suggest that we can especially appreciate Ruhi Ramazani for three enduring contributions, not just to the past, but into the future. His teaching and his service to this university, his path-breaking scholarship, which still speaks into the future, and his celebration and exploration of Jeffersonian ideals for the modern world. He took Jefferson seriously. I have a fond sense of deja vu here, in the sense that I've been part of conferences, forums, and tributes to Professor Ramazani before, going back to 1994 when President Casteen helped us sponsor and organize a conference in Professor Ramazani's honor even then. And at that point, we're celebrating his 40 years of service to the university and to our field of inquiry. I even published a bio-sketch of his life works in light of the traumas and, yes, the dramas of his early life in an Iran very much in great turmoil. At different points, young Ramazani had found himself getting nearly killed amidst bread riots in 1943, then later becoming an outspoken liberal nationalist student activist at the University of Tehran. He witnessed then two-day thugs assassinate his law school dean in front of him. Then in related incident, a classmate was murdered in front of him, and then those seeking blood were screaming out the name Ramazani, Ramazani. Some of you know the story, which many of us have written about since then. They were wanting, Ruhi was their next target. Ruhi and his friends escaped the melee by chanting, "Get Ramazani, get Ramazani." And they managed to escape through the crowd at the time. As many of you know, such ordeals, such struggles convinced Ruhi, even at that time. I'm sorry, I'm having a little trouble because I'm realizing so many great friends that are here today with us, and as I scan around the room, I'm catching different images, and it's all wonderful, and I'm glad you're here to celebrate this wonderful life. But those traumas, that background, that was part of the reason why Ruhi Ramazani dearly loved this place, everything that this place stood for. When he would dedicate his books to the University of Virginia, a place where he found freedom, where he found happiness, he meant that with every core of every fiber of his being. that was profound for me to come to understand and to realize and to appreciate. And I know I have so many members of his family, and I hope you all know that those were not just words. He meant that. And I know some of you are now, his grandchildren are now students of here, which is, I'm sure, did thrill him to no end. Again, those three things I think we can remember him for the future. First, his teaching, his method. When he said that the university, Thomas Jefferson's model for this university, here we are not afraid to tolerate error so long as reason is free to combat it. That meant the world to him. It graced the front piece of all of his syllabi, and it meant a lot in practice. Here's how it translated into teaching. As you're going to see when Rui gets the last word, when you get to watch the video, he was very serious about not telling us what to think, not telling us what the answers were. When I first sat in on his courses, and some of you are nodding your heads because you know just what I'm talking about, I wanted to hear him lecture more. I wanted him to tell me what the answers were. I wanted him to tell me the final say-all of what was really going on with the Arab-Israeli conflict. I first sat in on a seminar with him in spring of 1984, and I thought that was how I was going to finally figure out what was going to happen. But he wanted to, for the seminar theme was to contemplate what happened in Iran in 1953. And again, some of you, and at the time I was saying, 1953? I want to know what happened with the revolution, but he wanted to go back to 1953. I didn't know at the time that this was the Dean of Iran Foreign Policy Studies. I didn't know that that was the story of his initial life and why he had to flee from Iran. I had the joy, though, of coming to know the man. But in any case, here's his method. Here's his method, and if you'll pardon me sharing one personal story. In that seminar, I was not properly impressed that he was the Dean of Iran Foreign Policy Studies. I decided to do a paper on Iran's foreign policy, revolutionary Iran, and its policies towards Pakistan and Turkey. I didn't know that I was supposed to be unduly impressed, but he was interested, he's supportive, and helped me make sure I found good sources. Then I gave a presentation, and I figured that I was contradicting what his argument was, or what I had thought his perspective was. What was extraordinary is at the end of my presentation in that seminar, the pencil was tapping on the table, and it was nothing but affirmation, a thrill that he had set me on my own course and that I had discovered with his guidance, of course, at the margins, but he celebrated each and every one of us as students making our own discoveries and supporting us in that quest. That was priceless, and I would suggest that's part of the method. He didn't tell us what to think, but as you're going to hear him say in the video, he helped us to think better. And that is a priceless legacy for this university. The second big legacy of Professor Ramazani is his scholarship, and you've already heard several mention that. He wasn't just known for being the Dean of Iran Foreign Policy Studies, but yes, that indeed was one of his great contributions to the field. There's so much in his work and in his legacies that are powerful reminders for us. I'm publishing an essay coming up in a journal called Critique, where I will be, in fact, suggesting to readers, if you want to understand how it was that Iran wanted to come to the deal, to get the deal done with the United States, to look at it from what was driving Iran's perspective, read Rui's book. It's in there. It's his understandings of diplomatic culture, his understanding of the interests that should be bringing the two countries together, despite all of the many problems of which he was profoundly very aware of. That was among Rui's legacies of anticipating what was happening. Some of you know that in 1964, he was one of probably the only scholar that I know of who anticipated the Iranian Revolution. Not that he was happy with what was happening, but he looked at the then repression of an obscure clerical uprising in Qom, Iran in 1963, and anticipated that if this is not resolved, this will come back to haunt us all. And that was part of Rui's gift in being able to stand back from the politics of the day and yet draw upon his vast understandings of the politics and culture and history and be able to speak to problems at hand. And yes, I won't repeat what other speakers have already said, but last thing I want to emphasize is, and this is not as well known here at the university, but Mr. Ramazani's dedication to Jeffersonian ideals. I saw this in so many ways. Some of you know that there is something called the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, sponsored by Robert H. Smith, and some of you are here from that magnificent center. I was honored to be a fellow there. Professor Ramazani was on the founding board at Monticello, of this center at Monticello, and his emphasis was that this was not just to be a center for studying, to doing better scholarship on Jefferson, but also to be contemplating the legacy, the echoes of Jefferson for the world. And I know that, and I've been talking to some of the Monticello scholars about this since then, there was a certain amount of hesitance or is that a little bit beyond our reach? And Professor Ramazani's emphasis was, no, that Mr. Jefferson, as Professor Ramazani actually gave a lecture at, not a lecture, but a talk at Jefferson's graveside in April of 1996. And he emphasized there, I'll just quote briefly, that Jeffersonian message of freedom is universal. It is for all nations and societies. Although Jefferson's innate optimism about the spread of freedom worldwide was tempered by doubts as he grew older, and yet he never gave up that hope that the changed conditions of humankind might produce favorable soil for the plant of freedom to grow and flourish in any culture. For Professor Ramazani, Jefferson's ideals for the world were relevant. It was inspired partly by his hope that we would have a center there and perhaps here that would welcome and nourish scholars contemplating the Jefferson legacies, the Jefferson echoes for the struggles that they were going through within their own countries. And lastly, if I may close just with one personal anecdote. I was fortunate to be with Rui near the last day that we had him with us, and it was always a joy to be able to spend even a few minutes with him. And I just shared with him that I had this vision of being able to do a course on Iran in world affairs, and I really wanted to use his last collection of essays, and I'll be using Trita's book and the book that I did with the late Sandra Mackey, and we dearly miss her too. But just to be contemplating the lessons that Rui would have us understand about Iranian diplomatic culture. And Professor Ramazani looked up at me, Mr. Ramazani, as we still would call him respectfully, and he started doing this at me. And it was along the lines of, that will be so good for my heart. And I said, well, it would be even better still if you can come and join us. And while he may not be able to come and join us personally, it's his legacy, his ideals, the lessons that he taught us that I hope to be carrying with those students, and I will be encouraging them to explore on their own. Thank you for bearing with me. Thank you for coming. And it's so good to see so many wonderful friends.
Ruhi Ramazani, my friend, my teacher, my mentor, was a political scientist in love with words, and words loved him in return. Although he spent the last 62 years of his most fruitful life in the US, he continued to speak an impeccably exquisite Persian to the end. Remarkably, at times, he would resort to reciting a line or two of poetry to clinch a most sophisticated political argument, something our political scientists might consider. Ruhi's closest childhood friend was the prominent poet Feridun Moshiri. With your permission, I would like to read an excerpt from one of Moshiri's poems to say farewell to my friend. I will read the poem in its original Persian, followed by its English translation. بی تو مهتاب شبی باز از آن کوچه گذشتم، همه تن چشم شدم، خیره به دنبال تو گشتم، شوق دیدار تو لبریز شد از جام وجودم. تو همه راز جهان ریخته در چشم سیاحت، من همه محو تماشای نگاهت. آسمان صاف و شب آرام، بخت خندان و زمان رام، خوشه ماه فرو ریخته در آب، شاخه ها دست برآورده به مهتاب، شب و صحرا و گل و سنگ، همه داده گوش و آواز شباهنگ. یادم آید که دیگر از تو جوابی نیامد. پای در دامن اندوه کشیدم، نه گسستم نه رمیدم. رفت در ظلمت غم آن شب و شبهای دگر هم، نگرفتی دگر از عاشق آزرده خبر هم. نکنید دیگر از آن کوچه گذر هم. بی تو اما به چه حالی من از آن کوچه گذشتم؟ Without you, one moonlit night, I walked down the street. I became all eyes, everyone searching for you, everyone longing to see you. The luminous garden of your remembrance was in full bloom. The fragrance of your memory hugged the breeze. Your eyes, brimming with wisdom, filled me with joy. The sky was clear, the night was calm, fortune was smiling, time was tame. Clusters of moonlight danced on the pond. Trees reached for the moon, the night and the meadow, the flowers and the rocks. Listen to the nightingale's tune. And suddenly, a tear fell from a tree. The lamenting night owl winked away, and I could hear you no more. I could hear you no more. I wrapped myself in my sorrow, incapable to cut ties, unable to leave. I was immersed in grief. And now, pray tell me, how can I walk that street without you?
My name is Ramazani. I've been asked to read excerpts from a testimonial by Robert Fatton, who unfortunately could not be here with us today. The passing of Ramazani has left a void in the lives of everyone who knew and loved him. I share your profound sense of loss and am honored to say a few words about my remarkable friend and colleague. For me personally, Rui's passing represents an end of an era. At every major stage of my career, my advancement was assisted by Rui's quiet but forceful advocacy. During these years, I came to marvel at what I call Rui's touch, his magical capacity to move people consensually into his own orbit and make improbable events not only possible, but ultimately quite real. I know I am not alone in my gratitude for Rui's support. Over 5 decades, he played a major role in the transformation of his beloved university into a premier national and international institution. Rui's admirable accomplishments were matched by many wonderful personal qualities, such as his sense of humor. For example, when confronting serious health problems and the bodily implantation of some tiny atomic particles, he told me that he was becoming an environmental danger, that he was going nuclear. His wit and endearing chuckle will always stay with me. On many occasions, including our co-editing of 2 books together, I also had the pleasure of learning from Rui. His knowledge of history, his deep understanding of politics, and his intellectual openness were simply exceptional. When I visited Rui for the last time a few months ago, he was frail, and I sensed that he thought that he might not be with us for long. Yet when we talked about international affairs, he was engaged and alert, exhibiting the sharpness that had always characterized him. institution builder, distinguished scholar, wise mentor, and dear friend. Ruhi, we miss you. Let me simply end by thanking Nesta and the entire Ramazani family, includes myself, for asking me to help honor his gallant and distinguished, this gallant and distinguished gentleman who graced our lives, Robert Fatton.
Thank you all for being here to honor the memory of our father. This gathering is a manifestation of his having touched our lives. What I wish to speak to today are a few aspects of who he was. Our father loved America. I sometimes think for Ruhi, coming to America was like winning the lottery. He loved the freedom to write without fear of reprisal, freedom from the repressive nature of an autocratic government. This does not mean that as a naturalized American citizen that he did not also value Persian culture. It was the blending of these two cultures that helped to make him unique. The support of his wife, Nesta, helped to create a fertile base from which to endeavor. They were a team. What do we have at the end of our lives? We have memories. So what are some of the memories that I will retain of him? I will remember that the grandchildren were a great source of joy in his life. It was wonderful to witness their interaction. He gave them gifts of time, attention, admiration, conversation, and love. These gatherings were a celebration of life. I noticed along the way that Dad would sometimes refer to America as this blessed land. That statement gave me some insight into his capacity for gratitude. I will remember his recognition and appreciation of what my son Anthony and I mean to each other, and how he praised my fathering of him. I will retain what I thought and how I felt when he once remarked to me that there is not a single day that goes by that I do not think of Feridun Milani, our dear friend Farzaneh's husband that had passed. We all know of his love of Persian poetry, music, crafts, and architecture. He once had said to me that as soon as he saw the lawn of the University of Virginia, he was enamored with it. I can still visualize his elation at the news that our mother had given birth to a girl. I think he was yelling from the top of the staircase or something. It's a girl, it's a girl. And after the three of us, I think you can understand why. It will stay with me also how very happy he was when he learned that Catherine and I had chosen Kaveh as our son Anthony's middle name, as this was the name of our dear mother's little brother that had passed. He drowned in the pool while she was stricken with typhus. We will all recall the many times at Nag's Head together. I have distinct memories of him taking us to Skyline Drive, Sharando Lake, and the Ridge Drive-In Theater in the old black and white four-door Ford. Do any of you remember the Ridge Drive-In Theater? One of the things I liked about him was his spontaneous and clever sense of humor, sometimes tailored specifically for my highly inappropriate taste. Dad really loved his goldfish pond and his one large white koi. I think he called it hegemony. Our mother's flower and shrub gardens were joy to him. He really liked his tomato plants too. He greatly loved the view of the Blue Ridge Mountains from his deck. That was a source of solace to him. About 2 years prior to his death, he had a white oak tree that was on his property felled, I think at your behest, and sawn into boards for me. He said to me, remember me when I am gone and you build furniture from this wood. I used some of the boards to make a tabletop for my brother Jahan. He had a wonderful career, wife, friends, and a full family life as well. All this from a man who grew up in a house with a dirt floor studying by an oil lamp, who dared to follow his dreams.
My name's Jahan. That was my brother David. And you'll hear from the little girl, Seema, in a little bit. I'd like to say first, on behalf, again, of the Ramazani family, our heartfelt thanks to all of you for being here, and especially for our wonderful speakers for their poignant and illuminating words of remembrance today. We're all grateful. I actually hadn't planned to speak today, but you know how it is with older brothers. David thought it was more appropriate for us to speak, and he wanted to speak, so he insisted that I speak. So that's why I got bullied into speaking. But once I realized this was my fate, instead of writing about my father, as in the obituary, I found myself wanting to write to him. And having enumerated his public achievements, I wanted to write something more personal. So at noon today, on this 40th day that marks the end of the formal mourning period in Persian tradition, I sent him one last email. And there was no error message, so who knows? The UVA server has sent that. Dear Dad, we're gathering to remember you today. Close friends of yours readily agreed to speak. All of us kids and grandkids are attending, and of course Mom, who gave you more love and care and support than anyone. I miss you so much. The whole family misses you, and we didn't know so many people would miss you. I'm sorry that all our love couldn't protect you from that last terrible fall. Cancer, heart failure, stroke, you survived it all, living much longer than you expected. Who knew your own stairs would take you? I'm sorry your goldfish swim around lost and aimless because you're not there to feed them. I miss your voice, Baba, the reassurance of the silly, mock formal Persian we put on at the start of our daily call. I miss your touch, Baba. Those hands that were hard when we were kids, but became soft and gentle with age. Stubble on your face, too. Once razor sharp, but later smooth as a toothbrush. I miss your smell, Baba. That too potent cologne that lingered on us for days after our family dinners. We miss eating with you, Baba. Kebab, badamjun, tahdig, all the foods you loved. We miss seeing you, Baba. That head you were so pleased still had more hair than mine. That head of yours. Even with the fog of insomnia and stroke, your intellect and wit pierced through. In your last hours, you predicted in your hospital bed, Trump will be our next president. We thought maybe you were out of it. But as usual, you understood politics with more acuity than any of us. That head of yours, on that last day when it was cradled in a brace, bones broken all down your neck, and spine. You kept asking in Persian for your parched mouth to be swabbed with water. Ab. You have to say swab, not ab, Baba, or the nurse won't know what you're saying after Mom and I leave. An hour later, showing you could still learn despite the body's wreckage, you said to me with a twinkle of pride, swab, swab. Baba, I put the slippers you left to wear at our house up on the sideboard with the obituary and pictures. Maybe one of your beloved grandchildren will walk in them someday. But for now, they sit like two empty black canoes that have crossed a river. Baba, even if I can't speak with you again, I will be thanking you the rest of my life for the values and memories you've left me, the family, the world. Baba, glad we said it often in your later years, but I want to say it just once more. Baba, Baba, I love you.
So I'm the little sister. And my brothers were punishing me by making me go at the end of this entire thing. It was so eloquent, and we really appreciate everybody's words and everybody attending today. And I do actually hold a very special place and appreciate my whole family. So just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and Scott Harrop managed to get together some video footage of an interview that was done with my father in 2007. And as many of the speakers mentioned, my dad was always persistent and liked to have the last word, so in showing the video, we're going to let my dad do that. The family, we're going to go ahead and retreat to the lobby now as you're watching the video, and if you would like to join us afterwards for a few refreshments, that would be wonderful.
What the university has meant to me has been what I put as a dedication to one of my first books, and that is where I found freedom to think, to write, to teach as I wished, and also I found happiness. So in a nutshell, I can say it has been my intellectual and professional home. The book I did on Iran's foreign policy has been recognized as a quote-unquote classic, and the reason for that being that until then there was no study in any language on a systematic study on Iran's foreign policy. And that has given me the title of Dean of Iranian Foreign Policy Studies. Ever since that book, I have written a lot about Iran's foreign policy, Persian Gulf, and in books and articles, op-eds, reviews, and so forth. My most important contribution to the university, I believe I should say first and foremost teaching, because I impacted the lives of many students, and they have written me, they have told me how I affected their lives and so on, dedicating book or whatever. And that was really the greatest thing I think I did. I have been recognized for the fact that I never tried to indoctrinate, proselytize in any sense, and tried to help students to think independently on their own, and also to develop what I call empathy with the other, to be able to put themselves in other people's shoes, whether or not they agree with them, to understand, because understanding is extremely important to me. One of the things that we as Americans tend to disregard is the overriding importance of history, historical memory in the Middle East in general, however you define it, in terms of religion, in terms of politics, in terms of culture, art. There is a great lack of understanding that we as a young country, about 200 plus years, for example, we don't even try to say what people with about 3,000 or 6,000 years of history, how do they feel, what do they think. I think that is extremely important part of, again, of empathizing, to understand that people have historical memories, positive or negative. And that's one thing. The other thing is that we have got to be realistic about going and fixing the world around us. Fixing Iran, fixing Arab-Israeli conflict, fixing Persian Gulf security, that we have to understand the limits of our power in doing things, because other countries, including the ones we consider underdeveloped and backward, they have their own interests, they have their own values, and they have their own strategy and policy. A lot of problems in the world today, I think, lies in not so much misunderstanding, but lack of tolerance of other perspectives. And I think I had been able to get to my audiences over time, to my students, that being open-minded doesn't simply mean you are open-minded. It means that part of the important thing of it is that you would tolerate a dissenting view, and respectfully so. The underlying core value in that is that oneness of mankind, I should say humankind. And if we think in terms of humanity as one, and interestingly enough, in all the three Abrahamic religions, that concept does exist, that humanity concept. And if we live up to that, my goodness, we will have a beautiful world.